There are a ton of bad habits that you've likely developed in your time playing ARK, and there's a really good chance that these mistakes are worsening your experience as you play through the game. In this video, I'll go through 25 things you should stop doing in ARK to improve your next playthrough. And of course, stick around to find out why you should stop exclusively using air conditioners for hatching all of your eggs. One more thing before I get started, this channel is super close to reaching 10,000 subscribers. I would really appreciate it if you could subscribe to help me out. Up first is shooting tranks back to back with no downtime in between. This tip isn't important for every creature in the game, but it's extremely important for some. One example being the dire bear, which has almost as much torpor as it does HP, so if you trank it out immediately between shots, it's going to die most of the time instead of getting knocked out. This is because the trank doesn't deal all the torpor from one arrow or dart immediately, it does it over time. Once you hit an enemy with a trank dart or a trank arrow, it takes 8 seconds for all the torpor to be dealt. So if you're just instantly shooting whenever your weapon reloads in about 3 to 4 seconds, you're missing out on a decent chunk of the torpor. On screen now is a graph that I made using MS Paint. I know, it's beautiful, it's a work of art. You can basically see how much torpor is dealt over time. So there's a giant jump right when the bullet or the trank hits the creature, and then it tapers off, but it still does more torpor. After the 8 seconds runs out, the creature immediately starts losing torpor, so you want to be careful. Something like a Giga, for example, it's much better to just spam the shots because you're never going to kill a Giga, it has a lot of HP, and it doesn't affect the taming effectiveness how much damage you deal before you knock it out. For most applications in the game, this is just good because it saves you ammo and it saves you time farming resources to replace the ammo you waste, but in some cases like the dire bear for example, it is really good because it actually just lets you knock it out consistently. Number 2 is consistently turning off and turning back on things like fabricators and generators, especially in the early game when you're trying to conserve gas. When you're using a fabricator, especially in the early game and you're trying to craft things, turning it on and off again is really inefficient. This is because the gas will last 15 minutes when it's on before using a second piece of gas, and if you turn it on and off, it'll automatically use one gas every time you turn it on. A common misconception I see is that people think turning it on and off will make it save gas because it won't be on as long. This is not how it works. It automatically uses one gas whenever you turn on any gas-powered object. For example, let's say you turn on a generator to use it for 5 minutes, turning it on and then turning it back off 5 minutes later just to turn it on again in 10 minutes to use it for a different application is a total waste of 2 gas. One gas lasts for an hour in a generator and it lasts for 15 minutes in a fabricator, so there's no reason to toggle it on and off, especially if you're using it in close succession. Just one more piece of bonus information, the gas will also last for 15 minutes in an industrial cooker or an industrial forge, and it lasts for 20 minutes in an industrial grill. Up next is leveling tons of stamina points, especially in ARK Ascended. The problem with leveling tons of stamina is 2 things. First, in ARK Evolved, you just don't get as much leveling value out of stamina compared to movement speed, and in ARK Ascended, it's just really bad. First, let's talk about ARK Evolved. In ARK Evolved, movement speed is simply a better choice to upgrade than stamina pretty much all the time. While stamina is definitely okay because it lets you run longer and swing longer, upgrading more than 5 to 10 points into it is a huge waste. I've seen a lot of people that put 200, 300, 400 stamina on their character every single playthrough, and it just doesn't offer as much value as upgrading your movement speed, health, weight, fortitude, and even melee damage in certain builds. The reason for it being bad in Evolved is pretty clearly just because movement speed is so much better, but in ARK Ascended it's even worse because without movement speed being in the game, having high stamina is even more useless. The PvP application of running turrets or simply avoiding threats, and then in PvE running away from dangerous creatures, especially in the early game, are completely mitigated because you're just not fast enough to pull these things off anyway, so higher stamina is not going to help you there. And while farming by hand is a decent reason for upgrading stamina in general, it's not enough in my opinion to make it better than upgrading health, weight, fortitude, or yet again, melee damage in certain situations. To top it all off, you basically can always use stimulants or stim berries to balance out your low stamina stat, and in the late game, you're basically always on the back of a creature, so there's no point for stamina there either. The 4th bad habit I see a lot is traveling around the map without being fully kitted and prepared for the worst. ARK has a lot of different situations in it where it can kill you in super random ways, so bringing items like parachutes, bolas, grapples, food, water, and ammo really mitigate a lot of the threats. Even if you're traveling on a super strong mount, it's still very easy to die inside of ARK in certain situations like getting dismounted by a Microraptor or Prolovia, or you could simply run out of stamina or make another mistake because you're not paying full attention due to the fact that you've been playing ARK for a couple of hours or you just got distracted. A harpoon gun with nets is also a really useful item in Evolved, and when it comes out in Ascended, that'll also be a must bring for wherever you're going. On a similar note to being unprepared, leaving your base without your armor being fully repaired is a huge mistake that I see being made super regularly. Let's say you're out doing something dangerous or adventurous, you're farming in a dangerous area, you're trying to run a cave, anything like that, and your armor breaks, you have to go all the way back to base, repair your armor, and go back out because you're so vulnerable. This obviously doesn't matter much if your armor's on 90 or 80% durability, but if you're down to 40 or 30%, why not repair your armor? It only takes a few seconds if you're at your base, and it's so easy to do. I think that this boils down to people just forgetting to repair their armor instead of just looking at it, seeing that it's at 20% durability and choosing to not repair it, but it is a really nice habit to get into. It's also even more important in PvP than it is in PvE, because if you're getting raided surprisingly, you'd like to have the armor already repaired and ready to go so you can fight back. Number 6 is dismounting off a creature without checking your surroundings first, and this applies especially for dangerous areas. This one is really self-explanatory. Even if you have insanely good flak and really strong gear, you can still die to certain things in the wild. For example, if you're in the blue zone in Aberration and you dismount and you get grabbed by a Megalosaurus, there are a couple interactions like this. For example, if there's a bunch of Troodons nearby, Megalosaurus, Giga, Karka, there's a lot of stuff that can kill you in PvE even if you're super strong, so just be careful. You also have to consider where you're leaving your creatures if you're dismounting. Let's say you dismount to go run through a cave on foot, or you dismount to go farm something by hand. Just be careful of where you're leaving your creature, because you don't want that to be put in danger either. The 7th thing you should stop doing is using the whistle wheel for everything instead of using hotkeys for the whistle commands. A lot of people prefer the wheel over the hotkeys because it's kind of annoying to have to memorize a bunch of different buttons, and on console specifically, you can't really set a keybind for every single whistle in the game because there's so many. But relying on the wheel for every single command is a huge mistake. There's a lot of situations in the game where whistling for a specific creature to follow you or whistling passive is just a crucial thing to do, and if you don't do it quickly, it can really cost you. Let's say, for example, you have a flyer that you dismounted to farm something by hand, and then you leave it for a few seconds, look back, and there's a Rex munching it to death. In this situation, the flyer is on neutral and it's fighting back against the Rex, which means it's going to die very quickly if you don't do something. You go to your wheel and you try to push a whistle button, but you just misclick in the wheel because you're in such a rush, and the flyer dies because of it. This seems like a pretty niche situation, but it happens really often in the game. You get dismounted or you're off your creature for some reason, and your creature is fighting to the death and it's not going to be able to survive. Getting it out of there by whistling passive and follow is something that's really important to do quickly. You also want to have the stop all whistle bounded to your wheel, and you also want to have neutral bounded to your wheel for the opposite situation where your strong creature is getting attacked by something weak and it's not fighting back. Even though you won't find yourself in too many split-second scenarios inside of ARK, having the habit to use whistle command hotkeys instead of the wheel is going to save you at some point, trust me. It also just makes whistle commands a lot more smooth. Going to the wheel for everything is annoying, so if you have hotkeys for the stuff you use 90% of the time, it's much easier. Only bounding a certain amount of hotkeys is also convenient for controller because, yet again, there's not so many buttons, so if you pick a couple of whistle commands that you really want to be able to use, that's good enough. At number 8, I have carrying around useless items and random resources. Simply put, carrying around stuff that you don't need is a waste of weight, and carrying around things like resources so you can craft on the fly is also just really not worth it. This advice does apply to the entirety of a playthrough, including the early and the late game, but first let's talk about why it's so bad in the early game. In the early game, when you're traveling around on foot or low weight creatures and you don't have a super high weight stat yet because you're not fully leveled, it's super bad to carry around stuff that you're not going to need immediately in your kit. The logic behind this is that if you're flying around, there's generally 3 things you're trying to find: either creatures to tame, loot to farm, or drops to farm. In all 3 of these scenarios, you can realistically craft on the go for whatever you may need, including traps or spikes. There's no reason to bring around stuff that you may need to drop for extra weight when you're out there. It's just a waste. Up next is worrying too much about creature levels. In a lot of situations, the level of a creature isn't insanely important. This applies especially to the early game when you simply need certain tasks that creatures provide, like resource gathering and flying, and for maps like the island where levels are super horrible all the time, doing something like taming a low-level RG just for the utility of carrying a resource harvesting mount around is just something that's usually worth it. There's also more obvious situations like kibble dinos, and when you're super early in the game and you simply don't have a mount to ride on the back of yet, those sort of things you just need to get a creature of any sort. Lower levels honestly sometimes are better in those situations just because you need something and the lower levels are faster, but it's up to you. Up next is breeding without tracking stats, and more importantly, starting a breed line without good base stats. A very common thing I see people doing is when they tame a creature that they plan to use in a breed line, they upgrade stats on it immediately before noting down what the stats are. Noting down what the base stats are makes breeding a lot more easy because you can conveniently see if your baby has the better or the worse of the 2 stats from your parents. Obviously, if it has the worst stats in important categories like health, damage, or weight, depending on what the creature is, you just get rid of the baby. Another perk of tracking the base stats is so you know what mutation you actually got when you get them, instead of having to guess what stat was boosted. One more common mistake I see with breeding is when people look at a high-level creature and say, okay, this is a great start to a breed line. Sometimes the high-level creature gets really unlucky and gets a lot of points in stuff like oxygen or other wasted stats like food. So if you have those situations, you really don't want to use that as your parent. Let's say, for example, you're trying to get a really good theory line. If you have a really good theory that you tamed level 145, level 150, and you get it tamed, it's not going to be a great breeding parent for every stat. You want to put it into a stat calculator and see how many base points it got into every category. Ideally, you want to have one really good theory for health, one really good theory for melee, and then combine those 2 stats into one really strong line. It'll save a lot of time instead of going for mutations on everything. You can just pull a syntac and put insane rates on everything and get all your lines perfect in like 30 minutes, but that's not really how the game works in most situations. So if you're playing the game normally, just have decent base stats before you start a line to save yourself days and days of work. Hey everyone, hope you're enjoying the video so far. I wanted to quickly plug my Twitch because I recently started streaming over there. I've been doing an ARK Nuzlocke 100 days challenge recently, so if you're interested in checking that out, I'd appreciate it. The link is down below right next to my Discord server link, which I'm hosting giveaways in pretty regularly, so I'd appreciate it if you checked both of those out. Number 11 is leaving all of your dinos on passive. This one is really self-explanatory, but I've made this mistake myself so many times that I had to include it. If you're outside of your base and you're leaving all your dinos back, you don't want to have everything on passive because if something in the wild goes and attacks you, nothing will fight back. I'd recommend leaving your weaker creatures on passive and towards the center of your base, and leaving your stronger creatures on neutral towards the outskirts of your base as long as they're fenced in. I'd also leave some flyers on neutral as well, just because the flyers are a little bit annoying to hit for your ground creatures that are trying to fight back. So leaving something like a couple of RGs that have decent stats and are pretty slow so they're not going to get too carried away is a decent idea. Up next is leaving your base unprotected, which really does build off of number 11. ARK is a pretty dangerous game, and not having any protection on your base when there's so many different ways you can do so is just a really big mistake. The reason for defending your base in PvP is very obvious. Other people want to raid you, so defend your base. But in PvE, it's still a mistake not to have any defenses because there's multiple ways your creatures and your stuff can get damaged when you're not there. On certain maps like Extinction, corruption creatures can just destroy your base if you don't have defenses built up from the wasteland, and there's a lot of areas in the game where wild creatures can attack your tamed creatures and really cause some damage. The easiest solution in PvE is just to have a couple of creatures on neutral and have giant gates around your base so your creatures don't roam too far. Having giant gates that are at least stone tier will make it so that nothing in the game can really damage that structure in the PvE side. There's also turrets you can use, plant species X turrets, and plant species Y traps that are all also useful. If you're using the turrets in PvE, I'd recommend putting the range to low so you don't waste ammo on creatures far away, but it can be a nice assurance for your base. There's also creatures like the Volanosaur and the Calicotherium, which are creature-acting turrets. The Calicotherium is good for mobile Quetzal bases because you can't put any other turret type on the back of that, and Volanosaurs are an extremely cost-effective option for a base defense creature. The only areas in the game that you actually need to worry about your base structures themselves if they're stone or higher is in the corrupted areas in Extinction and now Astraeos. Corrupted creatures are able to damage any tier of structure, so just be careful in those situations and actually build strong turrets if you're building around those areas. One more point I want to bring up here is that you basically never need higher tier structures than stone for PvE. There's no real wild creatures that can actually destroy this besides the exceptions I've already mentioned, so don't waste the resources unless you want your base to look cool. Number 13 is trying to knock out creatures without being fully prepared. Trying to knock out high tier creatures, especially without enough narcotics, tranks, or even just having the food prepared in advance is a huge mistake a lot of the time. Let's say, for example, you're trying to knock out a creature and you haven't used Dodo decks to see how many tranks you would need. You go to knock out the creature, you shoot 80 tranks into it, and it doesn't knock out. Now you are out 80 tranks, and the creature's going to reset its torpor by dropping down before you can get more. What I would recommend is using Dodo decks for the creature you're trying to knock out at the level, and bring 1.5x the amount of tranks that Dodo deck says you need, just to account for you missing shots, taking too much time between shots so torpor drops slightly, and just in case they calculated it slightly wrong. I'd also have the narcotics prepared for when the creature is actually knocked out, as well as the meat or kibble that you're going to be using for taming it. If you're planning to use mutton, simply know where an Obus is beforehand so you can go kill it when the time is right. The mutton spoil timer is pretty bad, so killing it and getting the mutton before you knock out the creature is also a bad idea. Number 14 is traveling to distant or dangerous areas without first making backups of your gear. There's a couple of huge downsides if you go out and you die when you don't have a backup of gear. First of all, not having a backup of gear in your base makes it way harder to go back to get your original stuff. And building off of that, if you don't get your stuff back, it gets way more tedious to get back a full set of gear and get re-kitted because you don't have a set of gear to go farm with. Even if you are able to retrieve your stuff, not having a gear set as backup makes it take longer to go back to get said stuff. So the creature that you were out with originally is put in much more danger because it just has to sit in the wild by itself for much longer. This tip is especially important if you're traveling to an area that's impossible to get to without a certain set of gear. For example, a poisonous cave, the red zone on aberration that requires a hazmat suit, or underwater which requires scuba. Number 15 is just eating regular cooked meat and drinking regular water for an entire playthrough. Making custom recipes for food and water might be the most underrated game mechanic ARK has in 2025, and I highly recommend it. Custom recipes for both food and water come with heavily boosted health and stamina regeneration, as well as giving you far more food and water than standard consumables. Down below, I'll link the custom consumable ARK wiki page where you can mix and match a lot of things and learn how this side of the game works. There's so much customization here, and I just really love this feature. I'd also highly recommend having high crafting skill or just consuming a focal chili before you make your custom recipes because crafting skill increases will buff how good the recipes are. Slight side note before I move on, you should be mind wiping when you're doing a huge crafting session. I'm not going to put it as a separate point in the video, but using a mind wipe tonic, getting an insane amount of crafting skill before you craft a lot of a blueprint, and then crafting a huge amount of pre-farmed resources for a ton of a certain blueprint is much more valuable than just crafting it without crafting skill. A fully leveled level 105 crafting skill character can give you up to a 107% quality buff for any item. For something like a pump shotgun or a crossbow or a long neck, this is just game changing. Number 16 is another cooking mistake I see people making, and this time it's using berries and mutton throughout the entire playthrough for taming as opposed to making kibbles. Kibble is simply so much better than normal food for almost every taming situation in the game that there's simply no reason not to use it. The only downside for kibble is the barrier for entry for using it is higher because you need to get the eggs and you need to be ready to cook it, but besides that, it is just so much better and it's completely worth the effort. First of all, the time you spend setting up kibble farms will be given back to you in the form of getting tames done much quicker. The couple of hours that you spend setting up kibble farms will definitely pay dividends over time, and the fact that the time investment for getting kibble is the only downside is really telling. Kibble offers better taming effectiveness, higher speeds in taming, and the value of using kibble scales with the quality of the creature. What I mean by this is that even though the taming effectiveness isn't changed when you use mejo berries or kibble for taming a dodo, the difference will be apparent when you're taming something like a giga or a deinosuchus. The basic idea here is that the more food a creature eats, the more the taming effectiveness will drop if the food they're eating isn't kibble, so kibble gets more important with the length of tame. At number 17, I have using expensive ammo on non-crucial situations. Especially in the early game, using super expensive ammo to kill or knock things out can really slow you down. This is because in the early game especially, refarming up that ammo that you were previously using can take a lot longer than if you were in the late game. I basically recommend going melee only and using basic stuff like trank arrows until you get to the really high tier creatures. The early game creatures simply don't demand you to use really strong weapons or really strong ammo because they're just not that strong and the torpor demand to get knocked out is not that high. Number 18 is using air conditioners for every egg incubation through an entire playthrough. Using 8 or 9 air conditioners is a very consistent way to hatch everything in the game, but it's not the most effective for certain situations. In the early game, the only egg you're really ever going to be trying to hatch is the wyvern eggs, and in this situation, using standing torches or campfires is just much more cost effective anyway. You can simply use wood or thatch to power them, and they're very cheap to craft as opposed to making a generator for electricity plus the air conditioners required, which is way more expensive and takes much later into the game. Once you hit level 61 and unlock the air conditioner engram, it is generally considered the best option throughout that stage of the game until you hit level 89. But even in this level 61 to 89 phase of the game, Dimetrodons are also a really solid alternative, and there's pros to using them over air conditioners. The argument for the Dimetrodon is that you don't need any electricity or gas to power it because you can simply feed it. The air conditioners are a little bit less in your way, they have a larger AoE and you don't get stuck on their hitboxes, so there is some pros to using them as well, but it's really a personal choice. Once you hit level 89 and unlock the egg incubator, that is simply the best way to hatch eggs in the entire game in every single situation, so then again, the air conditioner for egg incubating purposes becomes obsolete, so it's really not as good as people say. In the early game, it's usually not the best, in the late game, it's definitely not the best, and in the mid game, there's an argument for you not even using it, so it's just a super overrated item. At number 19, I have using super high qualities of an item when you don't have a blueprint or backups for it. The reality is, those really important items are very hard to replace, and there's a lot of random ways that ARK is able to kill you even if you're super strong. Some examples of where this is really important is if you have one long neck rifle, don't run around with it in your hand. If you die with it and lose it, then you can't use it on late game tames, especially something like a Giga, which it's really important for to save a ton of ammo. And if you have a really good pump shotgun, don't use it when you're playing the game normally unless you have backups, because the pump shotgun is the easiest way to fight multiple bosses on a lot of maps. For example, on the island, the easiest way to beat both the Broodmother and the Overseer, which can be tough boss fights, is to simply go up to the roof of the arena and shoot down on it with a good shotgun. Up next is trusting random players on online servers, especially in PvP, but also in PvE. One of the most common ways to lose your base and your entire progress in PvP is getting insided by a tribe mate who you shouldn't have trusted, by them going into your tribe, getting access to your stuff, taking it, and then leaving to give it to somebody else. With that being said, it's just as easy to lose your stuff in PvE as it is in PvP. It's just usually not as detrimental because the PvP side of the game takes so much more grinding. I've also just personally experienced a ton more inciting in the PvP side of the game. The players are much more ruthless there. It's a very ugly side of ARK, but you should be prepared for it. Number 21 is refusing to use online tools. A surprising amount of players that play this game decide not to use any of the online tools because they want the experience to be more immersive. But if you elect not to use online tools like Dododex, ARK Unity, and ARK Wiki because you just want the game to be more immersive, you're really missing out. These tools really don't take much away from the game and they're extremely useful. Dododex is great for taming and figuring out how much you're going to need to knock out and tame a creature. ARK Unity is great for resource maps and creature spawn maps. And the ARK Wiki just has a ton of useful information about creatures, items, and recipes for custom food, custom water, and kibble. Number 22 is trying to swim across any sizable body of water in the early game. Doing this is such an easy way to completely reset your progress in the early game, because if you die underwater to one of the many hostile underwater creatures like piranhas, megalodons, mantos, or jellyfish, you will just lose all of your stuff every time. This is because if you die in anything that's not an insanely shallow river, your item bag is just going to drop to the bottom of the water, and it's going to be completely impossible to get back when you have no items. I have 2 rules of thumb for this in the early game. If you don't have any items and you want to cross over to a better area, feel free, because worst case scenario, you're just going to respawn in a random area anyway and you still don't have any items. But if you do have items, simply don't try to travel across any body of water that has a bunch of megalodons in it unless you can jump across almost the entire thing. I use megalodons as a reference because if the water's deep enough to hold megalodons, that means it's realistically too deep to get your stuff back if you die. Up next is a really basic one, and it's forgetting to back up servers that you're hosting. You can play the game as perfectly as you want. If you forget to back up your server and you crash, there goes a lot of progress. In single player and official servers, it'll automatically save your progress, but if you're using an unofficial server hoster like Nitrado, make sure to save your progress. If you're the manager of the server host, you can also set how often you want it to automatically back up, which is super useful. I know that on Bisect Hosting, which is the server partner for this channel, you have automatic backups already built in just to make sure your saves are safe, but on other server hosters, I'm not quite sure if they do that, so you might have to manually set it there. Up next is building on natural resource spawns. When you're in the process of deciding where you want to build a farming base or just your regular base, being near resources is a huge plus. With that being said, placing structures directly on where the resource nodes are spawning will just make it so those resource nodes do not spawn, completely wasting that farming potential. Simply build that structure you were thinking about nearby and not directly where the resources are. And last, but certainly not least, min-maxing the game on your early playthroughs when you're new to ARK is a huge mistake in my opinion. My stance is that if you're new to ARK, just enjoy the experience. It's a one-of-a-kind game to live through for the first time. I still remember my first couple hundred hours, and you never really get that feeling back. There's definitely a lot of joy in min-maxing ARK later in your playthroughs once you're more experienced and you know the game really well, but at the start, just enjoy, just get immersed in the game, and don't let the idea of playing through the game perfectly affect your enjoyment in any way, because there's no perfect way to play ARK. I know I made a similar point to this in my last video on the similar topic, which was 25 things you should start doing in ARK, but it's just so important that I had to mention it twice. If you enjoyed this video and found it useful, I guarantee you that you'll enjoy my other video listing off 25 things you should start doing inside of ARK. See you there. Peace!